Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Afghanistan, and we're going to hone in on two specific aspects of the country. Firstly, of course, the big news around the world, at least, is the Australia War Crimes Report. Australia releasing a report into how its soldiers were involved in at least the killings of 39 innocent Afghans. There are a whole host of harrowing details within those reports that have come out about children's throats being slit, 14-year-old boys' throats being slit by Australian special forces. These were during the years that, of course, Australia was on the ground in Afghanistan and involved there as part of the international coalition to defeat the Taliban, etc. And then, of course, the other major news from this part of the world is also a very significant trip of Prime Minister Imran Khan of Pakistan to Kabul, to the Afghan capital. What does this mean specifically at this juncture? Because we know that the peace talks have seemingly, at least on the outside, have stalled. Then there are, of course, interesting and important issues of bilateral relations between the two nations as well. There are neighbors, of course, and there always then have been back and forth issues of common and mutual understanding on many, many issues as well. The peace process certainly is one of the biggest looming issues that remains also very important for Pakistan, as it, of course, has always wanted that to go through to a final end. Let's discuss all of that a bit further, and I'm joined by Amina Khan, who is the director of the Center for Middle East and Africa, as well as Afghanistan at the Institute for Strategic Studies in Islamabad. She's joining us today from the Pakistani capital, Islamabad itself. Amina, thank you very much for your time today. Let's start off just, if we can, on the macro issue of the international coalition's involvement in Afghanistan and, you know, the allegations that have not only dogged, of course, Australia, but just the coalition as a whole vis-a-vis war crimes, vis-a-vis its abuses towards Afghan civilians. How much of an impact do you believe that has even today regarding how Afghan civilians, for example, would view the coalition, would view international players?
Well, you see, initially when, this entire episode took place where the Americans came, it wasn't only to, take out Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, but if you remember, Bush clearly said that the Americans were there to liberate Afghanistan. And unfortunately, as we have seen over the past 19 years, the country really hasn't made any strides, whether we talk about development, economics, infrastructure. And at the end of the day, it's the common man that has suffered. And as you rightly pointed out, it's not it's not only the Australians that can be held accountable. The Americans have time and again, conducted air raids against civilians, particularly if you remember back in Hamid Karzai's time, there were many collateral damage cases where the Americans attacked not only funerals, but also wedding parties. So this is something that has been happening, and it's very convenient for the international community to put it under the banner of collateral damage. But at the end of the day, it's the Afghans and the Afghan civilians that have suffered for so long, and that is why you see the same civilians or the same population that did not want the Taliban to be in power, that they have now reverted back. And, they're sick of the war that has been taking place, the war that has plagued Afghanistan, as I said, for more than several decades, but particularly since 2001. And that is why they want any semblance of peace, no matter how it comes, but that there should be some sort of stability. Because if one goes to Afghanistan, the kind of money that has been pumped into Afghanistan and, whether it's been aid or development, you do not see that on the ground, and the common civilian doesn't see it on the ground. And, year by year, you have reports coming out, not, from the international community as well as from the UN, that say that civilian casualties are on the rise.
Indeed, important beyond just, of course, a question of, peace, when certainly, of course, we can all agree that Afghans, as with any other people around the world, deserve to live in a peaceful and stable country. How important is also accountability then in this case, right? Because that's something that I've asked from a number of experts on Australia as well, as this issue has been looming for a while now, and even other countries, be it the US or other coalition members, about the importance of Afghan lives as well, right? Because we many times do not know the names and the details of those lives that have been lost as well. How important then do you believe it is to have, be it international law or respective countries' own judiciaries, hold people to account for their actions in Afghanistan?
No, of course, it's very important. You see, every life is important, and when an American soldier is killed, you see the kind of reaction you get, for example, in the United States or in the international community. And a lot of the NATO member states have also withdrawn their troops primarily because their troops have been dying. This is just an example. So Afghan lives equally matter. And of course, when it comes to war crimes, there should be accountability. But unfortunately, we've seen this in Iraq and we're seeing it in Afghanistan as well, where it appears that Afghan lives are not equal to the lives of, say, other international stakeholders. It's in front of you. And I think those countries, if they cannot answer this question, then I think it's very difficult for somebody sitting in the region to answer this.
Indeed. Speaking about the region, then, of course, Prime Minister Imran Khan has made that visit to Kabul, an extremely important visit at this time, at this juncture. A statement was released, by the Pakistani government right before his trip, and, in part, and I'm quoting it now, it says it'll deepen fraternal bilateral relations between the two countries, the Afghan peace process, as well as regional economic development and connectivity. I mean, am I fair to say, is it right to say, do you think that the major looming issue remains, of course, the peace process, and what do you make of Pakistan's role in that?
First of all, let me just comment on the trip. I think, we've seen, particularly since Dr. Abdullah's trip to Pakistan, that a positive momentum has been built between both these two countries, where we've seen a number of high-level visits, particularly from the Afghan side. And I think this is so important. Unfortunately, you see, we have seen during the past 19 years that, the Pak-Afghan relationship has been moving in a very negative trajectory, and it's been engulfed in this vicious blame game, which hasn't been, productive for either country, because at the end of the day, the goal is the same. And no matter what the international community says, or even what the Afghans say, the fact is that Pakistan needs a stable and a peaceful Western neighbor, whether it's for the security of Pakistan or whether it's for regional connectivity, be that CPEC, or even for economic development. So therefore, Pakistan is very sincere, and we've seen, particularly with this government, that they've really been pushing towards a negotiated settlement with the Afghan Taliban, of course. And you've seen Pakistan's role, whether it's been pushing the Taliban to sign the agreement with the US or convincing them to engage with Kabul through the intra-Afghan talks. So yes, primarily this trip, I think, while, yes, of course, trade is a major facet of the relationship and should further be explored, this was primarily, I think, a step on Pakistan's part to assure the Afghans that Pakistan is fully on board, it supports the peace process, and it will do what it can. But here I will say one thing, that while Prime Minister Imran Khan, he went with good intentions, and I understand where he's coming from when he says that, Pakistan will do whatever it can. I think at the end of the day, peace can only be achieved if the Afghans want it. And now, while the Afghans and Kabul have been sitting, although sporadically, and you've had ups and downs, but they are sitting in Doha, they haven't really been able to overcome the minor issues, which are very technical. So this just shows that, regional countries, including Pakistan, can only play a limited role. At the end of the day, the negotiations and the compromises that need to be made between the Afghans themselves.
Yeah. Final comment before I let you go then, Amina, on the issue of the American involvement, because it's interesting, right, that I'm sure you've seen those media reports that Donald Trump wants to pull out more troops from Afghanistan, in fact, pull out all troops, I believe, is at least has been his narrative for a very long time. But of course, we know that that's not going to happen, as in a complete withdrawal would probably not happen, at least in the near future, but even more of a withdrawal of troops. There is a worry, at least being spoken of and being reported in international media, that this would not be a good thing for Afghanistan at this time. What is your view on that?
No, completely. I think not only for Afghanistan, I think a hasty withdrawal, and if it happens in a haphazard manner, we've seen this before in 2014, when initially Obama did, if you remember, announce the withdrawal of troops. I think this would be catastrophic, again, not only for Afghanistan, but particularly for Afghanistan's immediate neighbors, those that share a border with Afghanistan. And Pakistan has seen this back in the 80s, and so did Iran. And interestingly, I think, regional countries, Russia, China, the Central Asian bloc, of course, Pakistan and Iran as well, they do not favor a hasty withdrawal, because I think it would be an exercise in futility, and it would undo the little developments or the little progress that Afghanistan has made. Therefore, I feel that one mistake that was made when the agreement was signed between the Americans and the Taliban was that major key aspects should have been addressed, which was the withdrawal, a ceasefire, and as well as the inclusion of Kabul, which were overlooked. Therefore, now, whether it's the Biden administration or if Trump can do something within the little time that he does have, is to put more pressure on the Taliban to reduce violence and engage with Kabul. And similarly, put pressure on Kabul as well to not, unnecessarily create hurdles and push for some sort of, stability and semblance. Because I think if the Americans leave like this, it would be highly irresponsible. And just one last point.
Sure.
While there is this notion that the Americans are withdrawing, do remember what Abbas Tanakzai said in the Moscow talks, where he clearly said that the Taliban would be open to some sort of American presence, be it in the form of development or reconstruction. So this clearly shows you that the Taliban are willing to accept some sort of American presence on their terms in the future in Afghanistan.
Very well there at that, Amina, but we do sincerely appreciate you taking your time out of your busy schedule to share your expertise with us here in Scope. That was Amina Khan, Director of the Center for Middle East and Africa, as well as Afghanistan at the Institute of Strategic Studies, Islamabad, speaking to us today from the Pakistani capital, sharing her thoughts on everything to do with Afghanistan. At this point, of course, the Australia story is the biggest one internationally, but within this region, it's also extremely important to see the role that Pakistan is playing vis-a-vis the peace process and otherwise when it comes to Afghanistan, and the Pakistani Prime Minister's trip to the neighbor is that much more important. And then there is, of course, the talk of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. There are, of course, a whole bunch of very fatalistic warnings about what may happen if there is a hasty withdrawal. Will Donald Trump even really be able to go through with that? Will the military really even allow for it? Or, of course, open questions. I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss an interesting statement that was made by the outgoing Syria envoy, U.S. envoy, to Syria. He's admitted essentially misleading Donald Trump about the true number of troops, U.S. troops that is, that are present on the ground in Syria, saying in part, I'm quoting him now, that we were always playing shell games to not make clear to our leadership how many troops we had there, end quote. Now, the actual number then, of course, as Jeffrey has admitted himself, is a lot more than the 200 troops that we've all been made to believe are on the ground in Syria, American troops, that is. Trump had initially, of course, agreed to leave that number there in 2019, even though he had, as we all remember, spoken of leaving Syria altogether, as he is now, about Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. Now the number accepted, Jeffrey says, and other experts say, is approximately around 900, even though that may be a low estimate or high estimate. We don't know exactly about that. But what does this then say about the U.S. policy vis-a-vis Syria overall and its involvement or lack of in that country at this time and going forward? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. I'm joined by Dr. Kurk Dorsey, who is a professor of history at the University of New Hampshire. He's joining us this morning from Durham, New Hampshire. Joining us from Doha in Qatar is Dr. Al-Azm, who is a professor of Middle East history and anthropology at the Department of Social Sciences at Shawnee State University. Amina and Kurk, thank you both for your time today and for taking your time out of your busy schedules to join us. Kurk, let me start with you. What does it say when your own envoy lies to you about the number of troops as you are the commander-in-chief? I mean, that sort of makes your job that much harder, doesn't it?
It was really a remarkable story for two reasons. One is he's still serving in the position and Trump is still in the White House. We've had over the course of the last 100 years cases where, say, the military on the ground or the military in the Pentagon has misled civilian leadership, but this appears to be the military and civilian leadership on the ground collaborating to keep the president in the dark, to keep the president from making a decision they don't want to make. So it is really a remarkable admission, partially just on his own, that he was violating the rules, but also a suggestion that the top people in the Trump administration weren't working very hard to keep track of what was really going on, because it shouldn't have been hard to find out that there were 900 Americans instead of 200 Americans if the intelligence agencies and the people in the top brass of the Pentagon were doing their job.
Amr, what thoughts about this? Because, from day one, it has seemed that the U.S. policy towards Syria has been sort of confusing, right? Looking from the outside in, of course, where, Obama was criticized about not being very hands-on when it came to Syria overall, and now Trump being lied to by his own envoy to Syria. What do you make of overall the U.S. policy towards Syria?
Right. Well, there's two things to put forward here. The first one is, the figure of 200 was never really a realistic figure, given the scale of operations and activity that we've known that is going on, and we've seen sort of both visually in terms of on TV or read in the news, or even seen on the ground for those of us who have contact or access to what's going on the ground. The fact that, simply from a military, if you will, point of view, and I'm not a military expert by any means, but 200 troops, if these are actual combat troops, will require anything between 4 and 5 support troops. If you think that a single Apache to go up into the air and do a mission requires handlers on the ground to load the ammunition, to bring the to maintain it, and so on and so forth. So the number of 200 U.S. troops is just, not there. And I think most people understood this realistically. That's one point. The other point is Trump himself. You have to understand also that Trump is a most remarkable phenomenon in his own right. There's not been anything like Trump or the way Trump operates or behaves in modern U.S. history. So again, the fact that there is collusion between the civilian and the military to keep Trump in the dark is hardly surprising, given the unusual circumstances that the whole Trump administration operates in, and more importantly, Trump's lack of interest anyway. Trump's only about himself and about his election chances and keeping his base together. But in terms of having a real understanding of the strategic vision or needs of the United States as the world's only superpower, really, that's not even there. So I am not surprised by any of this.
One of the things, Kurk, that come up, from Donald Trump's own mouth was that, that the U.S. was on the ground in Syria to protect the oil, right? That very vital and, keyword oil came up, and, a lot of people jumped on that at the time. But, in context, of course, Syria doesn't have as much oil as, of course, we would have within other countries that are oil rich. Nevertheless, do you think that that's played a role in any of this? It's confusing to know then what the goal is also, right?
I definitely think that the place of oil has played an important role in Trump's thinking about Syria. If we go back to what he said about the Iraq war, almost consistently, to the extent that Donald Trump has ever been consistent, he speaks about the need to take oil from Iraq. How are we going to pay for the war back early in the 21st century? Well, we should just seize the oil fields and keep them, viewing it very much as a business transaction. And it appears that one of the benefits of keeping control of some of Syria's oil fields is that they're using the money to supply the Syrian Democratic Front so that the United States doesn't have to give money directly to it. So purely from a business standpoint, it makes sense. And Trump thinks about the world in terms of exchanges and business exchanges in particular. So oil is definitely a big part of it. And at the same time, he, at some level, is, as my colleague just said, searching for a policy, much as President Obama did, for a really complex part of the world. He does not have a great attention span. He lets the people around him make decisions. But we could see this even earlier in his administration, when there was the back and forth over whether or not he wanted to assassinate President Assad, which he admitted to, then denied, then admitted to, blamed Mattis. Just this back and forth where his own inability to focus for any long period of time was only magnified by the problems in Syria. So it makes sense that he was going to defend the oil. And I agree completely. Had he thought about it, he would have known that 200 troops was not sufficient to protect something as vulnerable as an oil field. But thinking about it compared to thinking about Joe Biden and the constant pressure on the Russian front, it was not as important as those other issues.
Amr, what are your thoughts about the U.S. goal then in Syria? Is it to protect its quote unquote allies as the narrative goes? Is it about oil, or should the U.S. not even really be there? As of course I imagine you would know many people would argue.
Okay, so with regards to the oil part, I don't know what Trump knows or believes, just because he really is very ignorant. For all we know, he might think that there are massive oil reserves and oil fields pumping millions and billions of dollars out there, and he thinks he can get it down. But the truth of the matter is that Syria's oil fields are very, very limited in terms of their capacity. And as our colleague just pointed out, they are useful to maybe pay the bill for the SDF to keep doing their job. But beyond that, there's not much else coming out of there. So it could be that also Trump, if he is aware of this, he said it simply because he wants to keep, he wants to also explain to his base why he's even keeping those 200 there when he said he was going to completely withdraw. Now, in terms of the U.S.'s broader or wider strategic interests in the region, well, obviously containing Iran is one major, headache for, and I focus for the U.S. administration. And you can only do that by making sure that you have some foothold on the ground, and northern Syria would be the right place. Containing ISIS, that's another, the battle against ISIS, irrespective of who declares victory. We've heard various administrations declare victory over ISIS, but the truth of the matter is ISIS is still there. It can return and recover very quickly and has shown that capacity. And so you need to be there on the ground also to ensure that. And finally, also making sure that the Russians don't completely take over that area, with an eye on the bigger, sort of Russian West kind of power play that goes on, and Russian sort of infiltration into the region, not just in Syria, but in other parts too, as we've seen in the past few years. That would be my kind of take on this.
So then, Kurk, should we expect then, a President-elect Biden, once he is, in office properly, to drastically change policies towards Syria? Because it's not like when Obama was president, he was very, very, proactive about Syria, or very assertive about that either.
That's a great question. I expect, in general, in foreign policy, Joe Biden will try to recreate 2015, 2016 as much as possible. A, because he thinks that it was a successful time in American policy. B, I'm sure he thinks the nuclear deal with Iran, for instance, was the best way to contain Iranian ambitions, which is one of the central goals of American foreign policy right now. If we look at President Trump's attempts to strike deals between Israel and some of its Arab, well, I almost call them neighbors, but they're all pretty far away. That's, I think, driven largely by a decision that Iran needs to be contained, and that Israel is less of a threat to the Middle East than Iran. So in that sense, I think that Joe Biden will return to 2015, 2016, which means keeping some Americans on the ground to contain both Iran and ISIS. If anything, we might get more troops in and a more honest discussion about this particular war that the United States is involved in. When this story broke, it got almost no attention in the United States. I actually searched this morning just to see how many follow-up stories there were. And the only ones I could find were in the New York Post, which is a very pro-Trump paper, framing the whole question as, in effect, the deep state deceiving the Trump administration. Not whether or not the war was a good idea or whether we should be having more troops on the ground or fewer troops, but the question of deception. So I think in some ways the policy will stay the same, but the justification and the openness about it will change.
Amina, I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go. What are your thoughts about what may happen going forward vis-a-vis U.S. policy in Syria? Because at this point, it seems, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, of course, that we are at somewhat of a stalemate situation in Syria, and pretty much it seems that if the goal was to get Assad out, obviously that has failed. So what more is there really to gain then by being involved in Syria at this time?
The word stalemate is, you mentioned it, but it's not actually a bad thing when it comes to conflicts like Syria in this instance. And I think that's, and I agree with our colleague Kurk that we will see more of the same, maybe a slight shift in emphasis, a little more openness. I think there will be some efforts to revive the JCPOA. I don't think there will be a full rollback of the sanctions that some are fearing. And I don't think that there's going to be any real change on the ground vis-a-vis the US's involvement in terms of let's call them the rules of engagement on the ground in terms of the Kurds and the SDF and the areas under their control. So I would say more of the same, and that this stalemate in itself, as far as U.S. foreign policy is, from the U.S., let's say, strategic interest, is not a bad thing. Maybe for Syrians, it's obviously, we would like to see an end to the conflict and the removal of the Assad regime, or a change of some sort, but I don't see that happening, and I don't think the U.S. is going to really push for any of that.
Very well. We'll leave there as a final word, but we do sincerely appreciate both Amina and Kurk for their time today and for sharing their expert insight with us about, again, the story of, the outgoing envoy, U.S. envoy, that is, to Syria, pretty much admitting that he lied to Trump, hid vital information about how many troops are on the ground there in Syria. And, we discussed overall the U.S. policy towards Syria, or lack of, in some people's arguments, the Obama administration was too hands-off. It seems the Trump administration has also remained fairly hands-off to the extent that, of course, Donald Trump knows and the rest of us know if there are 900 troops really on the ground in Syria, again, what is their purpose? What are they doing? Is it to protect the oil? Is it to protect their quote-unquote perceived allies? What exactly is meant to happen now going forward? What will Biden do, if anything, different from what his predecessors have done and his own boss at one point had done while he was in the White House? These are all, of course, very open-ended questions which we'll wait and see, and I'm sure Syrians are waiting to see with bated breath as well. I'll leave it there for now. I'll be back with my final segment after this. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss the UK and its relationship with its own Muslim citizens. Two recent surveys have come out, one from the Labour Party and its relationship with its own Muslim party members. A third of them have discovered and feel that they have experienced Islamophobia within the party's own ranks, and that more than half of those Labour Muslim Party members feel that the current leadership does not, in fact, represent them well. On top of that, we have another survey of the Wolf Institute in Cambridge, which has found that Muslims were most frequently the subject of negative attitudes held by people of other faith groups. There are, I know, a bunch of other surveys that have also come out as well about the relationship right now that the UK establishment, as well as society in general, has with its own Muslim citizens as well. To discuss all of this a bit further, we're now joined by Arzu, Merali, who is a commentator, writer, researcher, and activist in the field of human rights. She's joining us today from the UK itself. Arzu, thank you very much for your time today. What do you make? Let's talk firstly about Labour, right? We talk a lot about conservative Islamophobia, and certainly Boris Johnson and the others make it easy to discuss that. But what of Labour and its Islamophobia within its own ranks? Do you think the party has done enough to address it?
I think the party's done very little, and it's not really a secret. I mean, we lived under a Labour government at the time of the so-called War on Terror's instigation, and that government was part and parcel of it. And that Islamophobia would have been endemic in that party for it to have even considered going down the route that it went down at the highest levels. I mean, we're not talking about a few bad apples making racist comments. We're talking about, policies set from the top. And we saw it with the laws that targeted Muslims, the anti-terror laws, the kind of political discourse that IHRC, Islamic Rights Commission, has been noting over the last 20 years. But quite honestly, even before that iteration, go back 30, 40 years, you had the leader of the Labour Party supporting most enthusiastically Salman Rushdie at the time of the Rushdie affair, and so on and so forth. So there's a long history here. It's not new. I don't think it's kind of a surprise, or it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, least of all Muslims, but there is a problem in the party.
But then I guess the question then becomes, Arzu, who then really speaks for the Muslims? I mean, if we have then both parties with such major issues with Islamophobia, who are Muslims then to turn to represent them politically?
Well, the issue of representation is something that doesn't just affect Muslims or minoritized communities. I mean, actually, the kind of crises we're seeing at the moment, including the rise of the far right, actually, in the UK, which is now more obvious and phenomenal than in previous years, is this fact that there is a huge gulf between the political class, or classes, I think we should just say the political class of whichever hue, and the masses, be they Muslims, be they Christians, be they Jews, be they defined as white working class, there is a massive problem when it comes to representation of beliefs, whether they're political, whether it's to do with cultural, emotional, spatial citizenship. We're not living in great times in Western Europe or the Northern Hemisphere with regard to any of these issues. But yes, clearly there is something a little bit extra attached to what's going on with Muslims because of them being scapegoated, them being victims of historic and recent Islamophobia in different guises.
And in a sense, I mean, obviously, Muslims have been in the UK for many generations, for a very, very long time. They are, a significant voting bloc as well, of course, as in, this voting bloc can have a huge impact on any respective government or any potential candidate, political candidate as well. Do you think that there isn't enough appreciation of that fact? Is it that the Muslims also don't realize that they have a strong political say in elections going forward?
So when I was a young woman, I used to think, and at the time we started IHRC, which was 1997, we actually ran the project because there was a general election that year called Muslim Election, in which we were actually trying to get Muslims to leverage their vote in an ethical manner. So, we surveyed MPs, and I think at that time it was about 50 constituencies, which out of 650 could or could not be significant, depending which way the wind blows, in terms of shifting or not shifting power. And we asked them their views on various issues to do with quote-unquote Muslim-related issues, whether it was about niqab, because there was a big anti-niqab hoo-ha even then, or hijab, or halal meals, or Islamophobia, hate crime, etc. It did not get the kind of purchase that we thought. We thought, in places like Blackburn, when we did the project again 5 years later, which was the constituency of the then Home Secretary, who was part of a very problematic government that was enacting all these anti-terror laws, it would have been, obvious for Muslims at that constituency to vote him out, and yet they didn't, time and time again. And it's only when I became older that I realized, well, actually Muslims do leverage those elections, but they leverage them for their local issues. And they've done it very well. So in all these constituencies, you'll find, a good supply of mosques, kind of relationships between councils, MPs, and Muslim community organizations. What you don't get is that bigger picture politics to do with legislation, national laws, or even foreign policy. And that's actually the British way. So in some ways, I think we're being a little bit harsh now that I've got sort of the hindsight of 20, 30 years of this type of activism. What we need is a kind of sea change in our political system per se, which does provide effective representation, whoever you are. So, for example, we don't need more Muslim MPs so much as we need all MPs to understand what Muslim issues are. But also people generally need to be connected. You would not have this kind of rise of really hateful politics and rhetoric and strict mobilization to commit acts of violence against Muslims and other minoritized communities if the people who are committing or who are being mobilized in that way felt that they were being represented as well. And that representation doesn't mean them getting a far right agenda into the mainstream. It means they get valued as a citizen and do not get them manipulated into these types of hatred.
I found the second, topic that we're going to discuss, the second survey, that is the Wolf Institute survey. That was quite disturbing because that shows negative attitudes about Muslims on the part of other faith groups. And I know that, of course, there are, and there is still major outreach, interfaith outreach as well on the part of the Muslim community. And there are certainly good relations as well with many leaders of other faiths. But has something gone wrong there? Is there a gap growing between people of other faiths and Muslims as well?
I've got to be honest, I'm not a huge fan of the Wolf Institute report, albeit that they had a very large sample. I think they missed an opportunity to do some serious work or do some serious analysis. As it is, they've kind of come up with this strange way of looking at the issue of Islamophobia in terms of as if other faith communities were somehow discrete, or even Muslims are discrete, or have only singular identities when they think about things. If there's a problem of Islamophobia in the country, there's going to be a problem of Islamophobia in faith communities. But the kind of questions that they raised, for example, would you be happy if your daughter, son, whatever, married a Muslim. I mean, these are not actually questions to do with racism. They've tried to use that as a proxy for biological racism. It doesn't quite work that way. I mean, forget about my kids marrying people who are not Muslim. I'd be annoyed if they married a Tory. Okay, it's not the same thing as racism, whether it's racialized against Muslims or against someone on the color of their skin. I think there've been many reports of which this is a small contribution. The Runnymede Trust frequently still comes up with different reports, whether it's about education. There's been a whole series of reports on the effect of PREVENT in healthcare, which is new. We knew what it was like in terms of policing for many years. There are great academics like Tariq Yunus working in this field, Aaron Kunani, Waqar Rizvi. I could give a list of people who are working in this who really probably should be taken more seriously. They have a long track record and they know what they're talking about. And ultimately, it's pervasive across the board. So if Christians or Jews or indeed internally within Muslim communities, and that's something we need to talk about, there is Islamophobia. It's not rocket science. We're in a crisis moment, and what we need now is people to start looking at solutions, not just simply trying to get more statistics to say the same thing.
Arzu, I wonder, just as a final comment, if I may, do you think that this issue of Islamophobia within the UK is in a vacuum, in a bubble? Because it doesn't seem like it is, right? We have Islamophobia spreading, or has been existent, in fact, for a while now in many European countries. So we can also talk about France, for example, and the very obvious Islamophobia that exists there. Currently, at least, it's very, very, very obvious and very easy to see through the naked eye. Do you think that this is all connected, or are there different contexts here?
Well, there are, different local contexts, but I mean, I think it's very clear. And again, I refer to people like Hashan Alkavitz, who's written about how Islamophobia crosses borders and cross-fertilizes across different contexts. And I think we see that very clearly. I'm right now editing a report on anti-Muslim hatred in Italy. I'm helping to write one, or finish up writing one, with various colleagues on the same issue in Germany. I've written over the years on the UK several times, France, and so on and so forth. So you see a borrowing and cross-fertilization, whether it's the type of laws, and Britain has exported this model of anti-terrorism laws all over the world, including to Muslim countries, or whether it's just about the kind of tropes that people use. So when I was growing up, God forbid anyone said we should copy France in the UK. It was a complete no-no. Now people talk about, well, look at how they're attacking Muslims, banning hijab, banning niqab. We should do that here. This type of thing is now transnational. So I think we're looking at a wider phenomenon, and we have to think strategically about it.
Indeed. Well, we'll leave there as a final comment. We do sincerely appreciate you taking your time out of your busy schedule, Arzu, to speak with us here and to share your expert insight with us. That was Arzu speaking to us there from London in the UK, sharing her expertise on these surveys, saying that the Wolf Institute survey, there is a bit of a shadow over it, and I agree with her because, when I read the details too, a lot of it just, at least to me, again, as somebody who's not an expert, mind you, in polling, did seem a bit odd. Nevertheless, of course, it comes in a line of other surveys, which have just shown at the very least that right now the relationship with Muslims in the UK society and establishment certainly is uneasy. That relationship is uneasy, and that needs to be discussed about why it is uneasy. The PREVENT program, the marginalization, stigmatization of Muslims, those are important topics to discuss too, because it's like Muslims have been there for such a long time that it just defies logic to now single out this community and say that, that you're not part of us, or that you're the other. Can those things even happen now when British Muslims have been so part and parcel of British society for such a long time? And then, of course, stretching this to European societies in general, in places like France, etc., the same patterns, of course, in different varying levels, exist as well. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.